Grace had been working in the surgical department of the first clinical hospital for more than 1 year and was long accustomed to increased workloads and unlimited working days. Someone kept saying that surgery was not a woman's business, but it was difficult to convince a talented woman doctor. Her best friend since school days, Emily, could only throw up her hands. "Where does it all come from in you? Just imagining such work makes me feel unwell." Grace smiled. "Well, what did you expect? Surgeons are not for everyone. Although every field in medicine is important in its way, you might even say invaluable." Emily looked at her friend with respect and smiled. This was Grace through and through. Devotion to the cause and working for the common good. From an early age, she had been interested in medicine, due in part to her grandmother Olivia, who was considered the best healer in the area. Although Olivia had no formal medical education, her services were in great demand. The kind granny had excellent knowledge of herbs and could talk for hours about the healing properties of one plant or another. Grace enjoyed listening to Grandma Olivia's stories, so she asked her to repeat them as often as fairy tales before bedtime. By the time she finished school, Grace firmly knew that she would enroll in medical school, choosing surgery as her specialty. Studying comes quite easily, as happens when a person has made the right choice in life and circumstances come to meet them halfway. She met her future husband during her internship. No, he had nothing to do with medicine. Benjamin had been hospitalized at the time with a bout of appendicitis. As fate would have it, Grace was one of those assisting the experienced surgeon during the operation. Not in the lead role, of course, but competently enough. The operation went well, and the next day, Grace came to see how the patient was feeling. It was from that very day that the young people started talking. At first, it was just conversations in the ward. Then, after his discharge, going to the movies, cafes, and walking in parks. Time went by, drawing the young people closer and closer together. To everyone, their union seemed ideal. And Grace herself thought so too. It's just that after the wedding, everything turned out not to be as rosy as the newlyweds' friends and acquaintances had imagined. Benjamin had always been obsessed with business. He seemed able to make money out of thin air, which to Grace was real magic. Unfortunately, business took more and more of Benjamin's strength, depriving him of the opportunity to spend time with his beloved wife. Endless business negotiations, long business trips, and phone calls at any time of the day or night could not contribute to strengthening family relationships. Despite this, Grace loved her husband and believed that someday everything would change. But time went by, and nothing changed. And then Benjamin died in a boating accident on the river. On that fateful day, he and his business partner decided to go out of town to talk privately about something important. This tactic usually worked perfectly, but that time, everything went wrong from the very beginning. A gusting wind suddenly stirred up high waves and the boat capsized. Although Benjamin was known as a good swimmer, he could not be saved. His failed business partner, on the other hand, managed to grab onto the side of the boat and survived. The drowned businessman's body was found several kilometers downstream, his body covered with abrasions from hitting the rocky rapids. Grace happened to be performing a major operation at the time, and the hospital administration, wishing to protect her from shock, informed her of her husband's death only at the end of the working day. At that time, it seemed to Grace that her whole world had collapsed. All this time she had lived with the thought that someday they would have a child, and would be happy. And now all her dreams were shattered. The funeral and all subsequent procedures seemed to Grace as if in a dream. It is difficult even to imagine what the unfortunate woman had to endure before she could emerge from the abyss of depression and longing. 3 years had passed since Benjamin's death, and during this time Grace managed to pull herself together a little and get used to being a 33-year-old widow. She did not want to start a new life with anyone. Now that the pain had dulled somewhat and was not as sharp as before, she only aspired to one thing: to regain her mental balance and peace. Besides, none of those paying court to her even remotely resembled Benjamin, and could not compete with him in any way. "You're still young," Emily would tell her. "If you spend your whole life within these hospital walls." But Grace always had a ready answer. "There's plenty of time. I used to put family first and work second, and only now have I decided to do the reverse." Every year after winter, Grace always went to the cemetery to visit her husband and tidy his grave, adding fresh soil and replanting flowers. But this year she just couldn't find the time, unfortunately. Arriving at the cemetery, the first thing she decided to do was to arrange with the caretaker. "I'll pay if only you could." But as soon as Grace looked into the eyes of the 80-year-old man, she immediately realized that money would not help her here, no matter how much she offered. To her great surprise, however, the caretaker did help her out with a suggestion. If not by actions, then at least by advice. He recommended a decent man who tidied graves for a fee. "That's Jack Smith, a good lad. Known him for years. He wanders about but doesn't drink or make trouble. Yes, and altogether a rather responsible man." "All right, would you give me his contact information? I'll be sure to pay for everything." Grace eagerly grabbed at this opportunity. Deep down, she felt ashamed that she would not be able to give her husband's grave the attention it deserved. But on the other hand, life went on, and she could hardly tie her own hands right now. She found the vagrant caretaker recommended to her right there in the cemetery, where he was putting another grave plot in order. "Hello? I need to have a plot tidied up. Add some fresh soil from the nearby ravine. Not too much. Then make a border of sand and also refresh the fence a bit," Grace began. Jack turned out to be a pleasant-looking man of about 35, with kind gray eyes and barely noticeable gray streaks at his temples. After attentively listening, he said, "Yes, of course I'll do everything. Just show me the spot and I'll fix it up in no time. You can check it afterward. If there's anything not right, I'll correct it." The vagrant's words aroused confidence, verging on delight in Grace. The thing was, Jack did not say a payment word. People involved in this kind of work usually start a conversation with talk of money, but he promised to do everything without mentioning payment. "And how much will I owe you?" Grace asked cautiously. Jack looked at her and smiled faintly. "Oh, however much you can spare. You know, sometimes a grandmother will come by living on a measly pension. How could I take money from her? All kinds of things happen in life. So I'm sure we'll work something out." Grace thought for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Opening it, she saw that she only had 2 bills inside, $100 and $150. Carefully taking the $100 bill, she held it out to Jack, but he decisively shook his head. "Oh no, that's too much, excuse me. I won't take it. It's better if you don't give me anything at all." Remembering herself, Grace immediately pulled out the $50 instead. In her opinion, it was far too little, and she felt ashamed about that. To her surprise, he said, "Don't worry, I'll do everything in top form. Afterward, you can check. If there's anything not right, I'll fix it. I'm always hanging around here somewhere nearby." Grace smiled, and after wishing him a good day, was now confident that her husband's grave would be tidied in time. She also knew that next fall she would do all the work herself. The 3 days Grace spent at the medical conference flew by unnoticed, packed full of new information. At some point, she even forgot about her agreement with the vagrant who had undertaken to tidy her husband Benjamin's grave, and only remembered Jack on the train ride home. "Oh, I should have checked on how it went. He seemed like an all-right man, but you never know." Getting off at the station, Grace thought that since the trip had taken so much strength and energy from her, she would only be able to go to the cemetery the next day, fully confident that Jack had carried out her instructions and tidied the grave. But as soon as Grace approached the plot, she could barely hold back a gasp of surprise. Not only had he not added any soil or refreshed the fence, but it even looked like he had not touched the grave at all. What's the meaning of this? I asked fair and square, and even gave him money in advance. So what? He deceived me? Grace thought, on the verge of tears, intending to settle this once and for all. She went to see the caretaker, George Peterson. As an older man, he was skilled at understanding people. Seeing the distraught guest at his door, he grasped the situation without words. Well, can't say much for the worker I recommended, that's for sure. Took the money and vanished into thin air. George Peterson shook his head. Yes, I know. Our Jack has disappeared somewhere, been gone 3 days now. Never seen anything like it from him before, especially since he doesn't drink. But here he took a sum from you, even if small. And now it's like he fell off the face of the earth. Grace was puzzled by the story, which cast doubt on her assumptions. She had thought the vagrant deceived her. But in fact, everything could be completely different. What if something had happened to him, or he had fallen ill, and here I was, accusing him so rashly? Grace reproached herself. She understood that a sum of $50 was not worth branding a man a liar over. The point seemed to be something else here. Jack had promised to help her, but then disappeared himself. That day, she tidied her husband's grave herself, taking the necessary tools from the caretaker's shed. Well now, so much better, Grace said, looking at her husband's photo. To be perfectly honest, she no longer regretted that little bit of money she had given Jack to tidy the grave, mere kopecks. As she walked toward the bus stop to wait for her ride home, she witnessed a very strange conversation between two old women. And what about our Jack? My, what a fine fellow! At the very last moment, he managed to save that girl, said one. Managed to save her, yes, but didn't save himself, got hit by that car. And whatever possessed the little one to run out into the road like that? For a moment, sinful as it is, I thought our Jack had perished. But no, the ambulance doctor said he survived, only he's in a coma now, replied the other. Grace listened closely as the old women started chirping about how even vagrants could be as good as normal people sometimes. And they too are capable of kindness and compassion. Still hesitant to jump to conclusions, Grace took out her phone and called an acquaintance who worked in the ICU. The news left her shocked. 2 days earlier, a man named Jack Thompson had been hit by a truck while saving a little girl who dashed out onto the roadway. The vagrant's condition remained critical, balanced between life and death, and he was in a coma. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. Just half an hour earlier, she had considered Jack a swindler who took her money without doing the promised work, and now the young vagrant seemed a real hero to her. She raced to the hospital as if on wings, and after talking to the doctor, Grace entered Jack's room and saw him entangled in a tangle of wires and tubes. According to the ICU doctor, the man could emerge from his coma tomorrow, or he could remain unconscious for several years. Everything would depend on his body's strength and health. Outwardly, that seemed normal enough, so they would have to wait and see, the doctor said. It took tremendous effort for Grace to hold back her tears. She had never before felt such pity for a man. Not even her husband's death stirred so many feelings and emotions in her soul. From that moment on, she began visiting the homeless vagrant's bedside in the intensive care unit. At first, the doctors and nurses watched her in bewilderment as she entered the room of this homeless drifter, but eventually they got used to it and even saw it as a good sign. The thing was, Grace had a reputation as a lucky charm, a kindly sorceress, whose patients sooner or later always recovered. Grace herself did not believe in this, of course, and considered it a mere coincidence. But those who worked with her knew the woman had some kind of hidden abilities, perhaps inherited from her grandmother, or perhaps developed within the walls of this medical facility. At some point, Grace wanted to find out about the little girl Jack had rescued, and here she experienced another revelation. Lily Williams turned out to be an orphanage child who had run away with some boys who promised her sweets and candy. Needless to say, she did not get the sweets, but she nearly ended up under the wheels of a passing truck. Lily's parents perished in a car accident, and she was saved by pure chance. When Grace came to see her and laid eyes on the little girl, tears welled up in her own eyes. Only now did she understand why Jack had thrown himself under the wheels. Lily painfully resembled a little angel with her light blonde hair and huge eyes that involuntarily drew one's gaze. "And why are you inquiring about the child? Do you want to adopt her?" the orphanage director asked cautiously. The question left Grace at a loss. To be honest, she had never considered taking a foster child. But on the other hand, the thought that she could become a mother made her heart beat wildly. Upon finding out what was needed to establish guardianship, she decided to start gathering documents without ceasing her hospital visits to Jack. Balancing on the verge between life and death, the young vagrant seemed to have little need for her attention. But assembling the necessary paperwork took Grace a month. The day she came for Lily was the best of her life. Seeing her new mother, the little girl immediately rushed to hug her. Grace wept unrestrainedly, clutching the small, trembling body to herself. They walked home hand in hand, Grace telling the baby funny stories while she laughed contagiously and constantly asked, "Mom, we'll always be together now, won't we? You won't take me back, right? Really?" "Of course not, dear," Grace answered with a smile. The next morning, she was awakened by a call from the ICU doctor. "Well, looks like your drifter's come too. Vitals are normal. He feels all right, just constantly asking about that girl. What was her name?" "Lily." And so they went to the hospital together. When Grace entered the room, Jack could not believe his eyes. It all seemed unreal somehow. "Thank you, Uncle, for saving me," little Lily said with a smile. Jack's lips trembled traitorously, and tears appeared at the corners of his eyes. Surely this was the best reward for not fearing to risk his life to rescue this little angel. Besides, Jack apologized to Grace for being unable to tidy her late husband Benjamin's grave. Needless to say, she harbored no resentment toward him. Jack had to spend about a month in the hospital before being discharged completely healed. Grace and little Lily, with a bouquet of wild chamomile flowers, waited for him on the steps. Jack smiled and, limping slightly, came closer. Then, somewhat awkwardly, he put his arms around them. From the outside, it looked as if a mother and daughter were meeting the father and husband who had vanquished a treacherous illness. Grace was prepared for this, and so she did not try to destroy the illusion of family happiness. Taking Benjamin by the arm on one side and Lily on the other, she walked toward a meeting with new, now family life. Subscribe to our channel and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one.